Imagine a world without electricity. No internet, no cars, no skyscrapers. Only stone castles, muddy roads, burning torches, and the sound of church bells echoing across cold valleys. This was the Middle Ages, a time of powerful kings, brutal wars, mysterious diseases, fearless knights, and giant castles that dominated the landscape of Europe. For nearly 1,000 years, the Middle Ages shaped the future of the modern world. But was it truly a dark age? Or was it a forgotten era filled with innovation, courage, and incredible stories? Today, we will journey deep into the medieval world. From the fall of the Roman Empire to the rise of mighty kingdoms, from Viking invasions to the terrifying Black Death, from noble knights to poor peasants struggling to survive. This is the story of the Middle Ages. To understand the Middle Ages, we must first understand how they began. For centuries, the Roman Empire ruled much of Europe. Rome had powerful armies, massive cities, advanced roads, and incredible engineering. But by the 5th century, the empire was collapsing. Corruption weakened the government. Economic problems spread across the land. Roman armies struggled to defend the borders. Then came waves of invading tribes. The Visigoths, Vandals, Huns, and many others attacked Roman territory again and again. One of the most feared leaders was Attila the Hun. His armies terrified Europe. Finally, in the year 476 AD, the Western Roman Empire officially fell. For many historians, this marked the beginning of the Middle Ages. Without Rome's control, Europe became fragmented. Large cities shrank. Trade became dangerous. Many people moved into small villages for protection. Life became much harder. But from this chaos, a new world slowly emerged. The medieval world was built on one important system: feudalism. Feudalism was based on land and loyalty. Kings owned large territories but could not control everything alone. So they gave land to powerful nobles called lords. In return, the lords promised military service and loyalty. The lords then divided their lands among knights. Knights served as heavily armored warriors. At the bottom of society were peasants. Most people during the Middle Ages were peasants. They worked on farms from sunrise to sunset. Life was extremely difficult. Many peasants lived in tiny wooden houses with dirt floors. Food was simple: bread, soup, vegetables, and sometimes meat. Disease and hunger were common. But peasants were essential. Without them, the entire feudal system would collapse. Meanwhile, nobles lived very differently. They lived inside castles with servants, guards, and luxury items. The gap between rich and poor was enormous. Yet medieval society depended on every level working together, at least in theory. One of the most iconic symbols of the Middle Ages was the castle. Castles were not just homes. They were military fortresses. The earliest castles were made of wood. But later, huge stone castles appeared across Europe. These structures were designed to survive attacks. They had thick walls, towers, gates, moats, and drawbridges. Archers defended the walls while soldiers guarded the entrances. Some castles took decades to build. Inside the castle walls, life continued every day. There were kitchens, chapels, storage rooms, blacksmiths, stables, and sleeping quarters. During war, nearby villagers often fled into castles for protection. But castle life was not always glamorous. Stone buildings were cold, dark, and damp. Hygiene was poor. Even nobles dealt with rats, insects, and terrible smells. Still, castles represented power. The larger the castle, the stronger the ruler appeared. Even today, medieval castles remain some of the most fascinating structures in history. When people think of the Middle Ages, they often imagine knights in shining armor. But the reality was far more complicated. Knights were elite warriors trained for combat from a young age. Boys from noble families often became pages around age 7. Later, they trained as squires. Finally, after years of preparation, they could become knights. Knights trained with swords, shields, spears, and horses. Combat was brutal. Armor could weigh over 20 kilograms. Battles were violent and chaotic. Knights followed a code called chivalry, at least in theory. Chivalry emphasized courage, honor, loyalty, and protecting the weak. But real medieval warfare was often cruel. Villages were burned, prisoners were killed, wars could destroy entire regions. Still, knights became legendary figures in medieval culture. Stories about King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table spread across Europe. These tales mixed history with fantasy, and they helped create the romantic image of knighthood that still exists today. Religion dominated medieval life. The Christian Church was one of the most powerful institutions in Europe. Almost every part of daily life was connected to religion. People attended church regularly. Priests performed baptisms, weddings, and funerals. The church also controlled education. Most people could not read or write. Books were copied by hand inside monasteries. Monks spent years carefully preserving ancient texts. Without monasteries, many important works from ancient history might have disappeared forever. The Pope held enormous influence. Kings sometimes feared the church as much as enemy armies. The church could even excommunicate rulers. This meant removing them from the Christian community. For medieval people, this was terrifying. At the same time, the church became extremely wealthy. Huge cathedrals were built across Europe. Some took over a century to complete. These buildings amazed people with their giant towers, stained glass windows, and incredible architecture. To many medieval citizens, cathedrals felt like gateways to heaven. During the early Middle Ages, Europe faced terrifying raids from the north. The Vikings. The Vikings came from Scandinavia, modern-day Norway, Sweden, and Denmark. They were skilled sailors and fierce warriors. Their longships allowed them to travel quickly across rivers and seas. Vikings attacked monasteries, villages, and towns. Their raids shocked Europe. Monasteries were especially vulnerable because they often contained gold and valuable treasures. But Vikings were not just raiders. They were also explorers and traders. They traveled across Europe, Russia, the Middle East, and even North America centuries before Columbus. Some Vikings settled permanently in conquered lands. Over time, many converted to Christianity and became part of European society. Their influence remains visible even today. One of the most famous events of the Middle Ages was the Crusades. The Crusades were religious wars between Christians and Muslims. In 1095, Pope Urban II called for Christians to reclaim Jerusalem. Thousands answered the call. Knights, nobles, and peasants marched eastward. The Crusades lasted for centuries. Some crusaders believed they were fighting for God. Others sought wealth, land, or adventure. The wars were extremely violent. Cities were destroyed. Thousands died. Although the Crusaders captured Jerusalem for a time, Muslim forces later regained control. The Crusades changed both Europe and the Middle East. Trade increased between different regions. New ideas, goods, and technologies spread across continents. But the conflicts also deepened religious divisions that lasted for generations. Most medieval people were not kings or knights. They were peasants. Peasant life was exhausting. People woke before sunrise and worked all day in the fields. Farming tools were simple. Harvests depended heavily on weather. A bad harvest could mean starvation. Many peasants never traveled beyond their local village. Entertainment was rare. But festivals, music, and fairs brought moments of joy. Families often worked together. Children began helping at very young ages. Medical knowledge was limited. Even small injuries could become deadly infections. Life expectancy was low. Yet despite the hardships, medieval villages formed strong communities. People depended on one another to survive. In the 14th century, disaster struck Europe. A disease known as the Black Death spread rapidly across the continent. Today we know it was caused by plague bacteria carried by fleas on rats. But medieval people did not understand germs. The disease caused fever, pain, swelling, and death. Entire towns were wiped out. Some estimates suggest that 1/3 of Europe's population died. Fear spread everywhere. People believed the plague was punishment from God. Others blamed outsiders or minorities. Society began to break apart. Workers became scarce. Economies collapsed. But strangely, the Black Death also changed Europe forever. Because so many people died, surviving workers became more valuable. Peasants demanded better wages and conditions. Over time, the feudal system weakened. The medieval world was beginning to transform. War was a constant part of the Middle Ages. Kings fought for land, nobles fought for power, religious conflicts fueled violence. Medieval battles were terrifying. Weapons included swords, axes, spears, bows, and crossbows. Later, gunpowder slowly changed warfare forever. One famous conflict was the 100 Years' War between England and France. Despite its name, the war lasted more than a century. During this period, a young woman named Joan of Arc became legendary. She claimed to receive visions from God and inspired French forces during battle. Eventually, she was captured and executed, but later she became a national hero. Medieval warfare was brutal, unpredictable, and deadly. Victory often depended on strategy, leadership, and luck. Although many people lived in villages, medieval cities slowly grew over time. Trade became increasingly important. Merchants sold spices, cloth, metalwork, and other goods. Markets attracted people from different regions. Some cities became rich and powerful. Guilds controlled many professions. Blacksmiths, bakers, carpenters, and craftsmen joined guilds for protection and organization. But medieval cities were crowded and dirty. Waste often filled the streets. Fires spread easily between wooden buildings. Disease remained a major danger. Still, cities became centers of culture and commerce. Universities also began appearing during the later Middle Ages. Education slowly expanded beyond monasteries and churches. The foundations of the modern world were beginning to appear. Historians debate exactly when the Middle Ages ended. But several major events transformed Europe. The Renaissance brought renewed interest in art, science, and ancient knowledge. Printing technology allowed books to spread rapidly. Gunpowder changed warfare. Kings created stronger centralized governments. And exploration opened new trade routes across the oceans. The medieval world slowly faded, but its influence never disappeared. Modern governments, universities, laws, architecture, and traditions all carry traces of the Middle Ages. Even fantasy stories today are inspired by medieval history. Castles, dragons, knights, kings, and epic battles continue to fascinate people around the world. The Middle Ages were not simply an age of darkness. They were a time of transformation, a time of war and faith, of suffering and survival, of castles, crusades, kings, and ordinary people trying to live through uncertain times. The medieval world shaped the future of civilization in ways we still see today. And perhaps that is why the Middle Ages continue to capture our imagination. Because behind the armor and stone walls, behind the legends and myths, were real people living through one of history's most dramatic eras. The age of the Middle Ages may be over, but its stories still live on.